Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to impartially unpack the really complex global and domestic narratives being presented in a major 2026 conservative news broadcast. We're going to look closely at exactly how this source frames everything, from high-stakes international diplomacy to hyperlocal city politics, and even the cultural battlegrounds heading into the midterms. It's an absolutely fascinating look at media strategy and political messaging, so let's jump right in and break down exactly how they are building this narrative.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're looking at 4 key themes today. Number 1, global shifts. 2, intelligence ops. 3, urban clashes. And 4, political strategy.
Starting off with part 1, global shifts and the China summit.
So the broadcast kicks things off with a massive, macro-level topic, President Trump's high-stakes 2026 summit in China with Xi Jinping. Now, the broadcast frames this as an incredibly historic meeting aimed at shoring up relations and opening markets. But the real friction we found in this coverage centers around Taiwan. Take a look at this exact quote presented by the source, where Donald Trump states, "I think the last thing we need right now is a war that's 9,500 miles away." The broadcast uses this specific statement to anchor a fierce internal debate among its own foreign policy commentators regarding what this summit actually achieved.
And this brilliantly illustrates the internal disagreement featured in the source. On one side, you have commentator Gordon Chang arguing that Trump is simply maintaining strategic ambiguity, basically protecting Taiwan and preserving the status quo. But then, right on the same broadcast, you have Michael Pillsbury arguing that the president is actually introducing a massive policy shift, completely reversing old stances with 6 new major changes, and implying tensions are the fault of Taiwanese leadership. It's a really striking contrast to see presented back to back.
To back up the claim of a massive policy shift, the source highlights a rapid-fire list of economic impacts coming out of the summit. They claim the meeting resulted in hundreds of billions of dollars in investments, huge new Boeing deals, restarting soybean purchases from American farmers, actively encouraging Chinese factories to relocate to the U.S., and allowing 500,000 student visas from China. Basically, the source frames this as an aggressive, overarching move to juice the U.S. economy heading into the midterms.
Moving right along to part 2, intelligence operations in Cuba.
Okay, so shifting from the grand stage of international diplomacy, The Explainer now looks at hardline actions happening just 90 miles from the U.S. border. The broadcast constructs a very clear cause and effect narrative here. It starts on March 30th, noting that the last Russian oil tanker arrived in Cuba. Cut to the present, and the Cuban electric grid has completely failed, leaving the nation totally in the dark. In response, the U.S. isn't sending a traditional diplomat, they are sending CIA Director John Ratcliffe to Havana. And simultaneously, the U.S. is reportedly moving to indict former Cuban President Raul Castro.
Now, the source makes it explicitly clear how they view these events. According to the broadcast commentators, Ratcliffe's visit is absolutely not about diplomacy. It's framed as a definitive, highly aggressive move to capitalize on a failed state, eradicate communism, and clean up the Western Hemisphere. They connect this directly to pushing out Russian and Chinese influence, presenting it as a follow-up to the recent removal of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. It's fascinating because they are intentionally framing this to their audience not as a diplomatic negotiation, but as a hardline geopolitical victory.
All right, that brings us to part 3, clashes over urban leadership. Turning our lens to domestic battlegrounds, we're looking at deep ideological fights occurring right now in America's largest, traditionally progressive cities. If you take a look at the breakdown here, you can easily compare the specific urban clashes highlighted by the source. In New York City, you have incumbent socialist Mayor Zohran Mamdani facing fierce pushback from billionaire business leader Ken Griffin over high taxes and wealth exodus. Meanwhile, out on the West Coast in LA, incumbent Mayor Karen Bass and local officials like Nithya Raman are being challenged by an outsider push from, of all people, reality TV star Spencer Pratt, with the broadcast citing severe issues of homelessness, drug addiction, and open crime as the catalyst.
Now, what's really interesting about this argument is the staggering number they use to anchor it, $500 billion. The broadcast claims that nearly $500 billion in wealth has literally packed up and fled New York for states with no income tax, like Florida, Texas, and Tennessee. They use this massive, eye-popping figure to drive home the argument that current city leadership is fundamentally alienating job creators and bleeding vital capital right out of their municipalities.
To further illustrate this clash, the source sets up a stark contrast in local policies. On one hand,
They point to progressive proposals, highlighting LA's Nithya Raman allegedly wanting to restrict backyard BBQs and Mayor Karen Bass proposing free replacement teeth for meth users. The broadcast contrasts this heavily with Spencer Pratt's campaign, which they frame as the authentic, common-sense response, anchored by his viral come-and-take-it messaging and a very aggressive women and children first platform aimed at restoring order.
And finally, let's wrap things up with Part 4, Political Strategy and Culture.
The broadcast seamlessly weaves these urban and global issues into a broader critique of the 2026 political landscape. A prime example of this strategy is how they utilize soundbites from the opposition. Take this quote presented from Kamala Harris. "This is a moment where there are no bad ideas, a no bad idea brainstorm, which includes expanding the Supreme Court." It's a classic media maneuver, right? Using the opposition's own brainstorming sessions to frame their overall strategy as radical and fundamentally out of bounds to the average voter.
Building on that, the source levels several specific critiques at the Democratic midterm strategy. They argue the opposition relies far too heavily on Barack Obama to parachute in and save struggling candidates. They criticize the running of candidates they deem completely out of touch, like James Tallarico in Texas, who the broadcast openly mocks. Furthermore, they argue there's a massive disconnect with male voters and a total lack of a coherent message, claiming the party relies entirely on just being anti-Trump.
But they don't just stick to standard political talking points. They actively blend serious geopolitics with viral internet culture. For instance, they actually dedicate a whole segment to discussing how Secretary of State Marco Rubio went viral for wearing captured Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro's Nike tracksuit aboard Air Force One. It's a totally bizarre pop culture tangent, but it shows exactly how the source uses humor and internet virality to build up the profiles of their favored political figures.
They also take some pretty major aim at the broader mainstream media culture. The broadcast highlights David Letterman's final appearance with Stephen Colbert, where Letterman chaotically misses a literal bullseye and throws a chair on set. The commentators use this as a potent metaphor for late-night television as a whole, arguing that by abandoning broad comedy to lecture their audiences on politics, mainstream media has alienated viewers, missed the target entirely, and caused their own ratings to plummet.
So, stepping back and looking at the whole picture, we've explored massive international summits, hardline intelligence operations, ideological clashes in our biggest cities, and the cultural battlegrounds of the media. Which leaves us with this final thought. Will this blend of viral internet culture, hardline policies, and outsider disruption actually win over the voters of 2026, or is it just going to further fracture an already deeply divided landscape? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the narratives you see.